Welcome back to Books and Bites. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of psychopaths.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's a little creepy too, though, right?
Definitely.
We're going to be looking at Christopher Berry-Dee's book, Talking with Psychopaths and Savages, and he basically had a chance to interview a bunch of criminals.
Real criminals.
Yeah, like really notorious criminals. And he kind of wanted to get into their heads.
Yeah.
To understand, like, what makes them tick.
That's a pretty belled approach, isn't it? Going straight to the source like that.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. But I think it offers, like, really unique insights that you wouldn't get just from reading, textbooks and theories.
For sure.
So before we get too deep into the cases, let's talk about what exactly makes a psychopath. Like, we hear that term a lot, but what are the actual, defining traits?
Right. Well, I mean, Berry-Dee makes it very clear that it's not just about being, a bad person or a criminal. It's a very specific set of personality traits. And, probably the biggest one is this really profound lack of empathy.
Okay.
They just don't, connect with other people's feelings. And then you couple that with an absence of remorse or guilt for their actions.
So they can do something really awful and just feel absolutely nothing.
Pretty much. It's like it doesn't even register on their emotional radar.
Wow. And they're often described as master manipulators too, right?
Absolutely. They can be incredibly charming and persuasive, which makes them, even more dangerous.
Yeah, like they put on this mask of normalcy.
Exactly. And Berry-Dee talks a lot about how easily we can be fooled by appearances. Like, we tend to assume that people who are charming and well-spoken are inherently good.
Right.
But that's not always the case. He actually shares some pretty chilling examples of how psychopaths use that charm as, a weapon to disarm their victims.
Can you give us an example?
Right.
What kind of thing are we talking about?
Oh, there's one story in the book that really stuck with me. It was about a serial killer who would, pose as this helpful stranger, offering to help people with their groceries or giving them directions.
Oh, wow.
And then he would use that opportunity to, lure them into a vulnerable situation.
Oh my gosh, that is terrifying. It really makes you think twice about who you trust.
Absolutely.
So these are predators hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And that's one of the most unsettling takeaways from Berry-Dee's book. These individuals can often blend into society really well. They can be your neighbors, your coworkers, anyone.
Right. We always hear about infamous figures like Ted Bundy. He was successful and charismatic, but also a horrifying serial killer.
Right. It's almost impossible to reconcile those two sides.
It really underscores how dangerous it is to judge a book by its cover.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on outward appearances. We need to be more aware of the subtle signs and trust our gut feelings when something feels off.
So, okay, how did Berry-Dee actually go about talking to these people?
Yeah, that's a great question. He does give some insights into his process, and it sounds incredibly intense.
I did.
He talks about needing a lot of patience and the ability to read, nonverbal cues.
Right.
And to engage in very subtle probing. It sounds like he was constantly playing this high-stakes game of mental chess with them.
Wow. So were there any instances where it was particularly challenging for him to keep his composure? Did he ever get rattled during these interviews?
There's this one instance he describes that really struck me. He was interviewing a killer who was describing a murder, but the way he talked about it was so casual, it was just an everyday chore.
Wow, that's chilling. It makes you wonder, where does that coldness come from? Are they born that way, or is it something that develops because of their experiences?
Yeah.
Nature versus nurture, right?
Yeah, that's the big question. And Berry-Dee explores both sides of that argument.
Okay.
He looks at things like genetics, upbringing, possible trauma, and he presents evidence for both nature and nurture playing a role. It's complicated.
So is there a definitive answer?
Not really. It seems like it's probably a combination of factors, but he does point to some early warning signs that can sometimes be indicative of a predisposition towards psychopathy.
What are some of those signs? What should we be looking out for?
Well, things like cruelty to animals, a pattern of chronic lying, a lack of empathy even at a young age, those can sometimes be red flags. But it's important to remember that those signs don't always mean someone will definitely become a psychopath.
Right, of course. But being aware of them could potentially be crucial for early intervention.
Yeah, definitely. Early intervention is key. Berry-Dee acknowledges that some individuals might be more resistant to change, but he also suggests that targeted therapies might make a difference in some cases.
So there's hope that maybe in the future we can find more effective ways to address this.
Yeah. But the question then becomes, if rehabilitation is so difficult, how do we deal with these individuals within the current system?
Especially given what you said about them being master manipulators.
Exactly. And this is where things get really tricky.
Yeah.
Berry-Dee argues that traditional methods, like focusing on remorse and rehabilitation, often fail when it comes to psychopaths.
Okay.
Because they can fake it, they can pretend to be remorseful to get early release, or they might exploit legal loopholes.
So are we basically playing right into their hands with our current system?
It's possible. And he calls for a more nuanced and specialized approach, one that recognizes the very real dangers that they pose and prioritizes containment over this, sometimes unrealistic hope for genuine rehabilitation.
Okay. So before we dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive, I just want to ask, what's the big takeaway for us, the listeners? Why is this important to know?
Berry-Dee's main point is that awareness is key. We need to be able to recognize the signs, to protect ourselves and others.
Right. But that doesn't mean we should be walking around paranoid.
No, not at all. It's more about finding that balance between awareness and trust.
Okay, that makes sense. It's chilling to think that these wolves in sheep's clothing could be anywhere, but at least knowing the signs can empower us to make more informed decisions.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right? And understanding this really complex part of human behavior can help us navigate the world a little more safely.
So this has been incredibly eye-opening already. And in the next part of our deep dive into talking with psychopaths and savages, we're going to go even deeper into some of the specific cases that Berry-Dee covered. We'll look at his interview techniques and talk about the bigger implications of his work for society as a whole.
Sounds good. I'm ready. Welcome back to our exploration of the world of psychopaths. We're continuing our deep dive into Christopher Berry-Dee's book, Talking with Psychopaths and Savages.
Yeah, and I'm really fascinated to hear more about these actual interviews. I mean, you mentioned he spoke to some really notorious criminals.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the biggest names in, well, I guess you could say, the world of crime.
Right, so who were we talking about here? What were some of the most, memorable cases he encountered?
Well, one that really stands out is Robert Maudsley. He was actually dubbed Hannibal the Cannibal by the British press.
Oh, wow. I think I heard that name before.
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling nickname, and it's unfortunately pretty accurate. He committed a series of, really brutal murders, both inside and outside of prison, actually.
Inside prison. So, he was already incarcerated and then committed more murders.
Yeah. Berry-Dee describes him as, highly intelligent, even articulate in a way, but deeply disturbed and dangerous.
I can't even imagine being in a room with someone like that, knowing the things they've done. It must have taken a lot of courage for Berry-Dee to even approach these interviews.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about that quite a bit, the need for extreme caution, both physically and psychologically. He stresses that this kind of work is definitely not for the faint of heart.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So how did he handle it? What was his approach going into these conversations?
He emphasizes setting clear boundaries from the start, maintaining professional distance and never letting your guard down. It sounds like he was very aware of the potential for manipulation.
Yeah, because we've talked about how psychopaths are masters of deception. So how did that play out in the interviews? Was Maudsley trying to manipulate Berry-Dee?
It seems like it. Berry-Dee describes him as being very calm and collected during their interview, almost eerily so, and there was absolutely no remorse for his actions. It was almost like he reveled in the notoriety.
Wow. So, classic psychopathic traits then?
Yeah, definitely. That lack of empathy, the accents of guilt, it was all there.
Did he offer any, explanation for his crimes? Did he try to justify them in any way?
This is where it gets really interesting. Maudsley actually believed that he was doing the world a favor by killing these people. He saw himself as a vigilante cleansing society of what he considered to be, undesirable elements.
It's a completely distorted perception of reality then.
Absolutely. It's a disturbing example of how their lack of empathy allows them to detach from the consequences of their actions and even create these twisted justifications for their behavior.
It's terrifying, but it's also fascinating, right? Trying to understand how their minds work.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a glimpse into a very dark corner of human psychology.
So who else did Berry-Dee talk to? What other cases are in the book?
Well, another one that's particularly disturbing is Joanna Dennehy. She's a female psychopath who was convicted of 3 murders.
A woman. We don't hear about female psychopaths as often, do we?
Not as often, no.
Yeah.
But they definitely exist. And Dennehy's case is particularly chilling. What set her apart was her, apparent enjoyment of the killings. Berry-Dee says she actually laughed and joked about the murders.
Oh my God. That is so creepy.
It really is, and it challenges, some of the traditional assumptions we have about psychopathy.
Right, because we tend to think of it as a primarily male disorder.
Yeah.
But this proves that's not the case.
Exactly. Denny's case is a stark reminder that anyone, regardless of gender, can be capable of these kinds of acts. It really underscores the need for that awareness and vigilance that we keep talking about.
So was there anything else, like any common threads or patterns that Berry-Dee noticed in all of these interviews? Besides, the obvious psychopathic traits.
Well, one thing that comes up repeatedly is this idea of manipulation and deception. And not just, in the context of their crimes, but also in their interactions with Berry-Dee himself.
Like they were trying to manipulate him during the interviews.
Oh, yeah. He describes how they would try to gain his sympathy, control the narrative, even paint themselves as the victim. Like they were always trying to work some kind of angle.
Wow. So he was constantly having to be on guard, trying to decipher what was real and what was just like a performance.
Exactly. And he talks about the importance of rigorous self-awareness, constantly checking his own biases and motivations to make sure he wasn't being played.
Man, that sounds emotionally exhausting.
I'm sure it was. But he also had his, professional training and experience to fall back on. He was able to use his knowledge of psychopathy to anticipate their tactics and stay one step ahead.
That's impressive. It sounds like a real mental chess match.
Yeah, you could say that.
Did he ever express, fear or apprehension about these encounters? Because, he was dealing with some seriously dangerous individuals.
He does acknowledge the inherent risk, of course, but he also emphasizes that his main focus was on understanding, not judging or condemning. He saw these interviews as a unique opportunity to really get inside the minds of these individuals and learn more about the darkest aspects of human nature.
It's fascinating, but also a little bit unsettling, isn't it?
It definitely is. But Berry-Dee's work is so important because it shines a light on this often hidden world. And the more we understand about psychopathy, the better equipped we are to deal with it.
Absolutely. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those broader implications in the next part of our deep dive. We'll talk about what Berry-Dee's work means for our justice system and how we can use these insights to better protect ourselves and society as a whole.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into that too.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into talking with psychopaths and savages. And, we've spent a good amount of time now talking about the psychology of psychopaths, so the chilling cases that Berry-Dee covers. But I think, the big question now is, what do we do with all this information?
Yeah, it's all well and good to, understand their minds, but how do we actually apply this knowledge?
Exactly. How does it impact, our legal system? How does it change the way we view human nature? How can we use it to protect ourselves?
Right. And Berry-Dee really gets into all of that in his book. One of his main arguments is that, the traditional approaches to dealing with psychopaths are just not effective.
Okay. So, what do you mean by traditional approaches?
Well, the focus is often on rehabilitation, on trying to elicit remorse, on assuming that everyone has the capacity for change.
Right. But you're saying that doesn't really work with psychopaths.
Right. Because they just lack that fundamental capacity for empathy and remorse. We've talked about how they can manipulate the system, fake remorse to get early release, that kind of thing.
So what's the solution then? What does Berry-Dee propose?
He suggests a more specialized approach. One that recognizes the unique challenges of psychopathy and prioritizes containment and management as opposed to just hoping for rehabilitation.
Okay, so more like protecting society by acknowledging that these individuals are, potentially very dangerous.
Exactly. It's about accepting that, traditional models of punishment and treatment might not apply in these cases.
That makes sense. It's definitely a shift in thinking, though, right?
Oh, for sure. But I think it's an important one. Berry-Dee is basically challenging us to, rethink our entire approach to dealing with this population.
And, it's not just about the legal system either, right? It's about how we view human nature as a whole.
Absolutely. This idea that evil can wear a very ordinary mask, that someone who seems perfectly normal could actually be capable of horrific things.
It's a pretty unsettling thought.
Yeah, it is. But I think that's why Berry-Dee's work is so important. He's forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
Right. Because if we're not aware of the potential danger, then we're more vulnerable to it.
Exactly. So it's not about being paranoid, but it's about cultivating a healthy sense of awareness. recognizing those red flags.
Okay, so going back to that nature versus nurture debate, I'm curious, like, what's Berry-Dee's take on that? Does he believe that psychopaths are born or made?
He presents evidence for both sides, and ultimately he kind of leaves it open-ended. It seems like with psychopathy, as with a lot of complex human traits, it's probably a combination of factors.
Right, so both genetics and environment play a role.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I think one thing he does emphasize is the importance of early intervention, like creating supportive environments for children, addressing childhood trauma. All of those things can potentially make a difference.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This whole deep dive has been so thought-provoking and honestly a little bit scary at times.
Yeah, it's definitely not light reading.
But I think it's important to have these conversations, to learn about this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. So as we wrap up, what would you say is like the main message that Berry-Dee is trying to convey?
I think it's about awareness, first and foremost, recognizing the signs. But it's also about cultivating empathy, even in the face of something that seems so devoid of empathy. Because ultimately, the more we understand about psychopathy, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves, to protect society, and maybe even to help those who are struggling with this disorder.
That's a great point. And, even though it's a tough topic, I think Berry-Dee's book offers a lot of valuable insights. So if anyone's interested in learning more, definitely check it out. Talking with Psychopaths and Savages. You find a link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to Books and Bites for more deep dives into the world of books. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.